So I'm sitting in what seems to look like a landscape, and I'm looking down a slope here in front of me, and I just walked up the slope and I sat down here. The landscape is relatively monochromatic in color. There is not a lot of difference in the stones, and it seems to be all from the same, let's say, the same resource. I wonder what people note, because now I made this, so I obviously see a lot of things that I'm not necessarily supposed to see, such as to what extent is the footmarks actually governing or organizing, the people who have walked here before. To what extent are they actually predicting how you would move through it? So this is quite interesting, and because I can sit here and say it's a sort of a landscape, and it's inside of a museum. There's white walls, there's a gray sort of rock landscape, but obviously there's much more than that. There's steps, there's the noise of the water behind me, there's the noise of the people walking by when somebody comes here, and there's also the quality of the light, the humidity, the atmosphere, you could say, the spherical conditions, some of which I have worked with quite carefully. Some of them are unpredicted. And the reason for me to go into these details, such as the daylight, really has to do with that obviously this is all artificial. It's something that I have made up. In a funny way, it's almost dead, the landscape, right? There's no signs of life except the water running through. The water for me is interesting because it flows. I mean, obviously it has a narrative because it's about a landscape and there is water and so on and so forth, but it's also about, if the water had not been there, it would have been incredibly, how should I say, static. So within this, let's say, silent landscape, there is that one element of something moving through it, and I'm not really sure whether the water is coming or leaving, but it is for sure moving. So there's not a goal. Also, you enter the exhibition at the end of the water, and you so to speak walk upstream. You walk against the water, and you could choose to interpret this in various ways, or you could also just experience it without verbalizing it. But I think it's quite interesting, for me at least, that the feeling that there might have been more water, in the rest of the room, or that the water somehow indicates that, the rest of the landscape would also at some point have been underwater, or might again be soon underwater. I find that quite interesting, and this is why I chose to have absolutely no signs of plants or anything in it. So just like when when you have a riverbed and the water have left, there's really not much left than the rocks underneath it. This, I think, is what I see when I walk in here. I have come here since the exhibition opened a few times to also watch the people, simply because when I work with an exhibition, I to some extent become blind, because I know every rock, what is under it and what is under it and all of that. And watching the people allows me to experience the exhibition through their eyes, and that kind of synchronizes my vision a little bit, so I can see what I have lost. And it's interesting because obviously I would like to think that I can predict to some extent what they see, but the truth is I can't. And this is really amazing, because I have a certain feeling of losing control, also having given the vision of the exhibition to somebody else. To stand next to a person and to put yourself in that person's place is not only about vision, but it's also about trying to imitate the motoric activities of the person. So not a lot, but occasionally I've tried to sort of do exactly what another visitor did it with a child and an elderly person. It's so funny, with a child, I sat, or sort of sat not so close, but I was close enough to see the child, and the child was with a group of kids, and an elderly person came in, and the child said to the elderly person, "You are too old for this art." So I was very curious about, why would the child say this? What type of understanding would somehow create a situation where the child would think, well, this is art for me, or I'm the right age, but what type of cultivation or history or what preconditions seems to suggest that the child wants to start to organize who has right and who does not have right to this quite interesting show, right? So in a way it's also scary that a child feels comfortable with sort of organizing who is in and who is out. So it's really interesting that some things I can predict and I can work with, but things happens also that are out of my control. Obviously, I challenge the individual in the way I challenge the individual in a way where I feel that the individual will take up the fight with me, right? So to sort of look at it, oh, it looks amazing. You come into the space, and if you have noticed, there's actually a long corridor where I have blocked the windows before you come in. It's just to prevent people from being so excited of the beautiful garden. So I just say, oh, it's too beautiful, I have to close the window. I just put wooden planks, because the floor is these amazing Swedish, stones, these tiles. Oh, it's too nice, I just put cheap wooden planks. So I kind of separate people from their comfort zone a little bit, right? So I say, oh, now something's gonna happen, they say. So it's like warming up, it's like priming. Then people go in and it looks like, wow, it's like a landscape, and who does not want to walk through a landscape? But then you start walking in it, and there's a synchronization between what you saw and what you do. And this is an interesting moment, because maybe what you saw created an expectation of how it would feel that was different than from how it was feel. Because you wouldn't really predict that this was to that extent so destabilizing. And this, so people go like, oh, and then they kind of have to spend a little time, let's say, reorganizing their speed, movement, and they realize they actually look down a lot, right? So a lot of people, they kind of stand still and they look up, and when they move, they look down. So there's a different, if you go into the micro details, there's a lot of different things that happens that I'm very interested in. But the discomfort, I would say, I also have to say, it's not like a huge discomfort. I'm not asking people to kind of climb the Mount Everest, but the discomfort does not lay in, oh, now I have to walk in a sort of not so comfortable landscape. The discomfort lays in changing your modus of contracting how you move with your ground. So first you feel, now I'm lost. I lost my normal contract of how to do things. But after a while, you actually gain a new, and it's not very new, it's just relatively new, right? So there's a little shift there. And I've often worked with this in my works, that you sort of take away some senses, the motoric, the balance, the relationship between sound and movement and vision, and then you think, oh, I've been taking away my normal guidance, I've lost. But very quickly we recalibrate, and it actually turns out, oh, I can move anyway. I have senses for this also. And what is interesting is, of course, we take it for granted that the way that our senses shows us our surroundings is natural. But the truth is, it's cultural. the way we take in the world is not natural, it's cultural. It is also to a great extent predefined by the way that the world has organized itself in order to optimize the quality of how we take in the world, right? If you want to sell me something, for instance. But so the fact that one can actually point to the fact that senses are actually relative to the cultural circumstances is very interesting, because it means that we should not take for granted that what we see as being real is necessarily real, right? Just shows that the interaction we have with our surroundings is actually a cultural construct. The way we engage in the world is based on our model. It's not based on truth. It's based on our social values, on our beliefs, our culture, how we grew up, what has influenced, what has created. It's all artificial, right? It's a construction. It is not necessarily any more real than anything else. But it's obviously important what I then present you with is also not real. You know, clearly it's like under these stones there's wood. It's in a museum, it's a construction anyway. So I'm not trying to suggest, well, now suddenly I show you the real thing. Well, my point is there are no real things. This is it. We are living in models, and that's how it will always be and has always been. And I find this very interesting because it somehow suggests, well, who has the authorship of reality? Where does it come from? What is then real? Well, what is real, I would like to suggest, is the way that you choose to handle your own model. To what extent does the model that you have chosen allow for criticality, or does it allow for you to feel interdependent with a society or in a system? Do you feel connected with the world? Do you feel that what you do actually matters? It's really not up to the world and its predefined definition of what is real to decide. It's really up to people who are, I think, in a situation, or who should be in a situation, to reconsider the way they engage as something that they do. So we don't take in the exhibition, I always say, we produce it by walking through it. That is to suggest the authorship of reality, if you want, lays within the beholder, within the user, within the museum visitor. The museum is constituted by the visitors. And this is, I think, such an important thing, and which is why one should trust the visitors to take the authorship to become creative. I would normally say that the museum and the work of art is one entity. I would not have done this if I was not making a show here at the museum. I think the meeting is obviously, one could generalize a little bit and say the meeting is about the conflict. The conflict of a museum being organized in a certain way. It's based on ideas about movement and experience. There's an idea about what is a painting. This is a typically sort of painting gallery type of museum, and it is scaled relatively domestically. It's very Scandinavian. There's a lot of features and details, such as the bricks and the quality of the light and all of that, which is very, let's say, traditional, or very similar to a local tradition. Everything is made in high quality. There's an element of crafts, the happy worker, the craftsman, and all of that. So a lot of things are, you can identify with them as something which, if you don't already have it, you would want to have it, right? So this is the kind of the bourgeois dream of this type of architecture. It's amazing, and it's also, not too amazing, right? Sort of right that on that border of what you potentially in someday might achieve. So interestingly, the conflict lays in the fact that the landscape has chosen to organize it based on a different principle, namely gravity. It has kind of flown through. And there is an older contract between the Danish modern traditions in architecture and the more contemplative ideas of Asian gardens or Japanese gardens and so on. And we know for the fact that a lot of the Danish sort of modern legacies, they were very interested in introducing this contemplative element into, let's say, the modern, and also with all the way into its social ambition. So that, and I find this, an interesting idea. So there's something relatively friendly between a rock landscape and this type of landscape, right? Or this type of architecture. I guess the friendliness lays in the materiality, because the Louisiana Museum is built so that you can see all the materials. The rocks, you can obviously also see its rocks and so on. In that way, there is a kind of, it's almost like a Japanese garden, one could say, inside of these walls on one side. And on one day you come and you walk through and you think, wow, this is very contemplative. On the other side, it is almost as if something catastrophic has happened. Something simply a river ran through the museum and it left this incredibly huge, not very beautiful and almost scary landscape. The doors behind us and over here, you can see by looking at the door, should you not know, you can see, my God, there's like, the museum has been ruined. And of course that is more fictional narrative, but the point is here, versus the contemplative, there is almost something like a mudslide, like some kind of catastrophe. Not very catastrophic, because it sort of seemed to have flowed like lava from a volcano, right? Just maybe it's like Pompeii, the city of Pompeii, the collapse of the first perspective and the collapse of a society. Maybe Louisiana represents the sort of idealized Pompeii, and this is the volcanic lava sort of eating up. When we take out the show, we'll find these negative casts of people who were buried underneath here when the mudslide came in. Horrible, right? But anyway, so there is that thing. And now it's the question, so when is it contemplative? Because I ask myself, and when is it stressing? This is interesting, because I think we kind of take it for granted. Oh, it's it's an exhibition. Why would you want to make an exhibition that is stressing? I mean, well, it must be contemplative. But the truth is, when you come here, the experience will determine what you see. And I have also thought a lot about the fact, well, there's so many people here, right? There's a lot of people, and of course I'm happy that it's apparently such a success. There's like in one day 1,500 people, or in the weekends, like it's totally packed. But what happens when there's so much people here is that, if we have a closer look, people start to synchronize their social patterns. This means that the diversity in the speed with which people go through the show declines. When there's 40 people in the room next door, there's a tendency that everybody starts walking, not totally, but relatively equal fast. They also tend to go in the same route. There's a sort of a social synchronization happening, which of course I would say goes against the idea of contemplativity, because that needs you to kind of focus on how do you feel yourself, and maybe choose a spot or a stone or an area in which you are incredibly focused and you get very slow. So when there's only 5 people or even 1 person in the room, there's a much higher diversity in the sort of speed with which you walk through the exhibition. So I've monitored, I call it, it sounds so technical, but I looked at people walking through the show, and when they were alone or really with few people, they would go very fast, very slow, stop, very fast again. So there would be almost like a ping pong between something highly focused and very pragmatic. Oh, I have to move. And then, wow, this is special. Whereas when it's packed, the experience gets more conventional, but it also gets more like ugly and dreadful, and like, there's no colors. It's like, all these people, it's stressing, and it gets a little bit depressing. And this is also very beautiful. This kind of, it's like a mudslide. Ooh. It's not at all like a Japanese garden, Ooh. And I really think this is also a big success. Because obviously I would like to think that in the contemplative potential there is a certain insight that I find really important, and we should nurture that. But on the other side, I'm very interested in sometimes a work of art, when it is good, it can actually hold a group and sort of create the situation in which there is a collective experience. And this might not be a very positive experience. I would like to see whether this experience still does not have the capacity to allow for a degree of individuality. So this is, I think, very interesting. Sometimes a room or space, and this is really also about architecture, can facilitate a group, and there's no doubt that people influence each other, but still allow for a relatively individual experience. So this is interesting because I think this is when a museum gets interesting, if it can have a lot of people and yet allow for people to be, let's say, singular in their perception of the world. And we know this is a challenge from our society. We have so much exclusion in our society. So as a model, exclusion based on, you disagree, you're not welcome. This space is only for, it's an in-group space, it's not an out-group. You are outside and we are inside. So I'm quite curious to see with this light stress, the kind of, the pragmatism that comes with having to funnel 1,000 people through. This is such an interesting challenge to see what is then, the resources. It's much easier to have one person who's like, oh my God, this is great. But to have, 50 people in the room and to try to see if they feel, to some extent, capable of developing an own opinion without being excluded by the other ones. So in a way, this is a discussion that I think is fundamentally about the notion of public. What does it mean to be public? What does it mean to be a public institution? What is the resourcefulness of the notion of public when it comes to institutional systems? This is very interesting, I think. It's because it's very much about our society. It's very much about democracy. It's very much about going against populism and nationalism and all these things that kind of, are defined by exclusion. We are not like you. That's who we are. You define yourself based on the negation of somebody else. So, and I think on a good day, this is actually possible in this work of art. And that's why I'm so excited about it. But I can also see sometimes, it's dreary and it's not a good day. And this is also then a situation that I have to deal with. Sometimes it's in a way kind of an elitist and a little bit hostile type of environment where people feel discomfortable because they just don't feel they understand it. Why should I walk through these stones? They say, why? It has nothing to do with me. This means that people are also in situations where they say, there's no identification. I do not see myself. I have no space in me, known or conscious or unconscious, that this reflects. I'm alienated, I'm excluded, I'm the out-group. Right? And this is also very interesting, because I'm sure this happens also at Louisiana. Sometimes you come and if you don't feel well, all this wellness might be a threat. My God, I'm not good enough. I'm a bloody loser compared to this amazing museum. And when can the museum say, well, you're welcome anyway. We like you and we trust you. And how can you work with that? And now this is there's a lot of thoughts, and my show is not necessarily directly addressing that. But when I work, I think of these things and I think about resourcefulness in this way. Always when I work, I try to get quite intimate with the local conditions and so on and so forth. And I came to the Louisiana Museum as a child. My father was a painter, and he actually at a quite young age took me here. It was clear to me that, I mean, because we lived like we did, that Louisiana represented something very different than somehow what constituted my life as a child. And this allowed me, to a great extent, to have, without making it banal, but to have a place which somehow confirmed that it is possible to have dreams that are totally irrational or somehow sort of beyond what I would normally live with, right? And probably this has now changed because I'm obviously a bit older. But when I was invited to show here, I was of course incredibly excited, both because of this very intimate relationship I have with this museum. I really care a lot for the museum, but it also gave me an opportunity to somehow investigate what is exactly the museological stuff that we have here. And as we know, the museum is a legendary museum, right? So one can say a lot of amazing things about it, and it is also really robust. Sometimes it's maybe so robust that it's actually difficult to make a critical statement, because it's just so well functioning that it seems to be right no matter what they do, right? It's very interesting that, you know, it's almost perfect. So I thought, why one has to really be quite firm if you want to make a. You really have to be quite firm if you want to make a kind of critical dent, or if you want to somehow to suggest to destabilize it a little bit. So what does it mean to destabilize the museum? Obviously it's a kind of critical inquiry, and so there are things that are great about a museum, but there are also things that are more difficult. And interestingly, the things that are great, they are all very visible. You know, wow, that's like amazing. And then there's things that are more difficult, and they are less visible, right? So you have to dig them out. And that could be, to what extent is what people experience so predefined and, you know, exactly what they expect, that there is, you know, it's just all affirmative. You know, to what extent do they come here to get something which is pre-digested, pre-organized? Where is the rupture? Where is the critical sort of friction? Where is the moment where people are lost? Where is the exhibitions that hurts? You know, what is pain? How does pain feel like? And obviously in society, it's very difficult to find, you know, a place in which one, under controlled circumstances, can go and somehow visit your own, let's say, pain, right, or doubt, to be a little more modest. And do the museum feel comfortable with challenging its audience with having to visit their own uncertainties, right? What does it mean to feel uncertain? Is that destabilizing? Or, you know, in our society, to feel uncertain is, you know, it's not as good as being certain, for sure. If you want to be a success, you have to be certain. This means that there's a tendency to marginalize or exclude, you know, uncertainty, right? Oh, you know, it's like doubt is considered counterproductive, right? And so on and so forth. So the museum, maybe to a surprising extent, has somehow adapted the kind of success criteria of our society. But as a museum, shouldn't it be a place where different types of success criteria should be celebrated? Not just, oh, we can also have doubt. No, why don't we make an incredible manifestation of uncertainty or doubt or something like this? So, and I think to some extent it already happens, because it is almost in all artworks, but maybe the museum also have to, you know, tell people, well, you have to, well, you know, it's not like shopping, you know, you have to work. You have to give something of yourself. If you give something, you also get something. Of course, it's a challenge if you walk through a consumer environment when entering the museum, because people are sort of predefined or prescribed to somehow expect that the museum has synchronized itself with that very consumer-oriented element. I know this is more complex and a long discussion also, but essentially one of the ways that I started to think about is how to, you know, actually exhibit the museum as a system as well. So I also say, when I'm here talk about it, there's a tendency to say, well, this is a landscape or some kind of rock, sort of something, right? But it's more than that. It's a museum with a work of art in it. And the boundary between the work of art and the museum are inseparable. Had the museum not been here, it would just be some stones. So this means that obviously the conditions in which all of this is taking place is what makes it a work of art. And the conditions are, of course, the good things, the success of the museum, which is remarkable, and it is also the difficult things. Is the museum becoming predictable and therefore less, let's say, artistically to the point? And this, I find, was some of the discussions that I then had with a great team here at the Louisiana, and I also saw that there is a discussion like that within the museum already. So I was not necessarily the one to bring anything new to the table, but it's an interesting discussion because it's obviously about not just what goes on into the museum, but what is the relationship between the museum and the world. Is the museum a reality machine, being a part of the world, or is the museum a picture of the world where you sort of step out of the world and into the museum to sort of escape the world a little bit? And I guess you have these two models where some would say, well, a truly contemplative and incredibly liberating place needs to be a step away from reality, because my God, reality is just so redundant and pragmatic. But I actually disagree. I think within reality, I mean, in every gutter there is a dream in which one can identify oneself. It's like, so I think that one, when walking into the museum, should see it as a way of amplifying what you know about the world already. And it's only when not stepping into some kind of representational safe haven, you are actually in a situation where you feel comfortable sort of questioning yourself. And at the end of the day, I think it's a lot about trust. People, a museum like this is obviously a famous institution, and the question is, do people feel comfortably with, or do they trust themselves to also critically ask themselves difficult questions? I would say this is the case for a lot of people, but not for everyone. And I'm very curious about what does trust mean, and who is, how do you examine or question or address the question of trust? Do you really feel comfortable destabilizing yourself on purpose? And this is why I think, walking on the rocks, and somehow it is quite literally a destabilizing thing. Walking uphill, sort of finding your path, making sure you don't fall, sort of recontracting your way of walking, somehow physically balancing your way out here. That recalibration of physical presence is, I think, something that, as a metaphor at least, but also quite specifically, should be in every museum at all times. On a meta level, it is in the kind of domestic but also organic way the museum has been laid out. But do people, to the full extent, or to the extent that it becomes about criticality, use it as a way of instead of seeing the museum, to see themselves? So to get back to trust, the question here, I think, not really is whether people trust themselves, is whether the museum trusts the people. And this is where it gets incredibly interesting, because do I trust people to walk through this landscape? Yes, I do. I think people, it's like easy, it's like not at all a challenge. I would say the museum thinks so too, but I think the strongest museums are the ones that trust themselves and don't act on behalf, or which is really more than don't act on the expense of the visitor by putting up signs, how to do, how to see, telling them this is art. The museum which are comfortable with art, and I know it's a difficult word to use. The museums that have confidence in the authority of art, which means that they set art higher than themselves, are the museums that also trust themselves and therefore trust the audience. And if audience feel trusted, you come into a museum and you feel it immediately. Wow, this place have confidence in me. If I feel that, I have confidence in me, and I dare to, get involved with an exhibition. So I'm very curious in this sort of, let's call it a kind of the currency of trust that is in. So preparing a show, I started looking into all these, what should we call it, like socio-psychological sort of layers, like peeling an onion with no core. You slowly, gradually try to get under the skin of the people. You try to see through their eyes. You try to feel, how do they feel under their feet? What does holding hands feel like in a museum compared to outside? And all these things I find really interesting and inspiring for creating the map of ideas out of which an exhibition can grow. After 20 years, I've become relatively exposed, and I'm often met with the critique that I'm so exposed that the kind of Eliasson is more famous than the show, and there's a kind of conflict in that, and this creates a problem. And I try to listen to the people who are critical of what I do, because maybe they have a point, and sometimes they do. I mean, I think it's counterproductive for my show if people expect to see an Eliasson exhibition, and in that sense, my let's say autobiographical stuff is in front of the exhibition, and people have to go through that to see the show, and they try to see it through my eyes. And becoming so exposed like I am now, there's a lot of people who sort of who comes and sees the show that knows things about me, knows about how I work and how I would normally do things, and they would to some extent already expect what they see. And that has been criticized, and I actually agree it is counterproductive to know too much about me, because I'm not interesting and it's not about me. But having said that, I really think that there is not enough critique, and the problem is a little bit that there is so little critique that there is not a kind of critical institution. There's no critical competition, and this is sad, because the critique it's just so important to us move on. And of course, I get old and sloppy, and I just get self-obsessed and egoistic, and it's all about me. And if it's not about me, I'm grumpy and so on. And the critiques are very right, pointing to that fact. So I should use it, and I try to do. The thing is, I work in a world in which the art world is a small little bubble, and sadly it's very bubbly. In the real world, I'm not famous at all. But on the other side, I have, over the last 5 or maybe 10 years, I've become very involved with a lot of other things with my art. So I'm not stopped making art and do something else. I've been showing my art or using my art or talking about art or teaching art in situations which is outside of the, let's call it the art world bubble. I've become very interested in educational systems, in policy systems, in political questions, and so on and so forth. And I think creativity and the quality with which creativity can be, let's say, turned into action, I think this is so amazing. I think creativity is like totally underestimated in the, let's call it, the world outside of the art world. And I can just, to reassure or somehow calm the criticism in the world outside of the real world, I'm not famous at all. People go, oh, so he has had a few shows or something. Doesn't really matter. It's still about what is a work of art and what does it do to people and so on and so forth. Clearly, the exposure in the art world, I've been able to then take advantage of that also. It's not just a burden. and somehow use it to somehow get a foot in a door and say, listen, I have to say something. I have to say something about art education in principle. I have to say something about why creativity is marginalized out of politics. Why is art not a part of the parliament? Why are you not having artists sitting in the parliaments? I think this is a great question. So exposure is relative. It's really relative from, you know, from where you see it. And 4 years ago, I had a really exciting year where I had an exhibition in Sao Paulo and one in Ukraine, in Kiev. And at the same year, I started teaching in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, at the university. And in all of these three places, maybe the director or the person who sort of organized the things knew about my work and so on and so forth, but everybody else did not. So this means that I don't think that I've come to the point yet where being exposed is counterproductive. And I think one can turn it around and use it to a benefit.